Okay, folks. Well, good morning to you. It is Tuesday, December 8th, and we are coming ever closer to the end of the semester. We are going to continue our discussion today of World War I, and I have a number of different things to talk about. I'm starting here looking at the timeline of major war declarations in World War I. I'd like to take a minute to remind you that in the beginning, when these alliances were made, they had different names. You might remember that the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente were the two major alliance formations in Europe. However, when the war begins, the Triple Alliance becomes known now as the Central Powers, and that would be these nations right here, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy had been in the Triple Alliance, but when the war begins, Italy switches sides because of a few different reasons, but mostly due to they felt that Germany was being overly aggressive in stoking this war, stoking this conflict. And so Italy changes sides when the war begins and is no longer part of the Central Powers. The Triple Entente, made up of Britain, France, and Russia, becomes known as the Allied Powers. All right? So, taking a look at these two, and you can see them here in red versus blue. Anything that's red is a Central Power, anything that's blue is an Allied Power. Austria-Hungary starts the war by declaring war on Serbia on July 28th. 3 days later, Germany and Russia declare war on each other. 2 days after that, by August 3rd, Germany and France declare war on each other. The following day, Germany declares war on Belgium, and the UK declares war on Germany. On August 6th, 2 days after that, Austria-Hungary declares war on Russia, and then Serbia declares war on Germany. On August 12th, the UK and France declare war on Austria-Hungary. And as you can see here, the list just goes on and on and on. And eventually we see we eventually see other nations come into the war, like December 7th, 1917, which we just passed the date, the anniversary of yesterday was December 7th, is the date that the United States declares war on Austria-Hungary. The United States had already been in war against Germany going back to April 6th of 1917, though. But we had not formally declared war on Austria-Hungary. They had just focused their efforts on Germany. But towards the end of the war, the United States declares war on Austria-Hungary, and by that point, Russia has actually left the conflict. They drop out of the war because of pending revolution that they have going on in their own country. So this is really the effect of all of these alliances, right? These alliances that had tied all of these nations together. Also, it's like, imagine a group of people that are all connected by a rope, and one of them jumps off a cliff. It's probably going to pull all the rest of them off the cliff with that person. And that's kind of what happens with World War I. The second that one of them declares war, all of them end up declaring war. And it even pulls in the colonial assets that they have in Africa and other places around the world. So August 1st, Germany declares war on France, and by August 3rd, Germany had invaded Belgium on its way to France. Now, if we take a look at a map here, let me pull this up here. Here's Belgium. Okay, Belgium is right situated between Germany and France. And the reason I'm taking the time to show you this map and show you where Belgium is because Germany basically just strolls through Belgium to France. The Belgians put up a stronger resistance than the Germans thought that they would, but it's not going to be enough to stop them completely. And the Germans proceed into France through Belgium. And the reason that that's significant, and I'm taking the time to mention it, is because tactically, or strategically rather, they do the exact same thing in World War II. So when Germany wanted to invade France in World War I and in World War II, they end up going through Belgium to get there. And that's partly what gets Britain involved in the war. That in addition to Britain being allied with France. But basically Germany turned the little localized war in the Balkans into a world war by attacking Belgium and France. And this is mainly why, when you look back at it, people blame Germany for World War I, and they're not entirely wrong about it, because Germany really had been already to this point aggressing the conflict, stoking the flames of the conflict. We have a name for it in hockey. We call it instigating. Okay, if you get put in the penalty box for instigating, it means that you were going out on the ice looking to start a fight. And so Germany was very much an instigator in this conflict. And in response, France declares war on Germany and Britain declares war on Germany. So the two opposing alliances, okay, the two opposing alliances that we see when the war begins are the Central Powers, which were previously known as the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and instead of Italy, now it's going to be the Ottoman Empire. Italy switches sides. Also, Bulgaria is technically part of the Central Powers. And then the Allied Powers, which was previously known as the Triple Entente. And this includes Britain, France, Russia, and then later on in the conflict, Japan, Italy, and the United States are part of the Allied Powers. When we get to World War II, they're not known as the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. They're known as the Axis Powers and the Allied Powers. And in World War II, Japan is no longer on the Allies. They're on the Axis. And Italy is as well. So anyhow, that kind of gives you a little bit of an explanation there. The Schlieffen Plan, okay? The Schlieffen Plan, the Western Front on the First World War, basically there was a problem that Germany was going to face in World War I, and that was that they were going to be fighting a two-front war. And they really don't want to be fighting a two-front war. Germany would much rather use the full force of its military all at once. See, if we go back up here and look at this map, right? If we go back here and look at this map, you can see Germany here, and you can see that France and Russia are on either side of Germany. And what this means is that because Germany is surrounded, right, they're going to have to take their military and split their military to fight halfway over here. Half their military will fight against France, and then half their military will have to fight against Russia. But they don't really want to do that. They would rather use the full force of their military all at once. And this is where the Schlieffen Plan comes in, which, by the way, ended up being a failure. So what is the Schlieffen Plan? It was the German military plan to invade France through Belgium, defeat France quickly, hopefully within 6 weeks, by sweeping around Paris, and then taking the full military and redeploying the military over to the Far East to defeat Russia. Okay, so once again, just to show you here on this map, the Germans' plan for World War I, the Schlieffen Plan, is to when the war begins, go through Belgium, invade France. Paris is around right here somewhere, okay? Invade France, capture Paris, take it in 6 weeks, and then, after France has been defeated, take the entire military, go back over here, and then fight Russia and defeat them. Okay? So kind of a 1-2 knockout punch to Europe. However, it does not go to plan. Okay? It does not go to plan. And the Schlieffen Plan ends up failing thanks to a battle called the Battle of the Marne. After the Germans came within sight of Paris in the early part of the war, September of 1914, French and British forces pushed the German forces back. And the French army at this time was led by a guy by the name of General Joseph Joffre. And the battle represented the end of mobility on the Western Front, because remember, what the Germans were going to try and do is very quickly defeat France and then turn around and go back and defeat Russia. But the problem is that the Battle of the Marne is really what ends up characterizing the entire First World War, because all mobility stops. The war turns into this stalemate conflict where they're stuck fighting on the same land with relatively no mobility, not moving around at all, in other words. All right? And so when we see this attack here, this is a very zoomed in image of France, Belgium, and Germany. Okay? So you can see the German forces trying to sweep through Belgium here to surround Paris. This is their military plan. Here's Paris right down here. Okay? And the plan was hopefully to defeat Paris or defeat the French really quickly and then be able to move back, but they're not able to do that because they get basically dragged down on the Marne River, and the war kind of just stops. You can see some of these rivers here there's a number of different rivers that run through kind of northern France here, all right? But the Battle of the Marne takes place, it's kind of tough to read where these are here. You can see, where is it? I found, here's the Somme, that's another major battle. The Seine, the Somme, the Marne. Here's the Marne. This is the Battle of the Marne right here. They get locked down right in this region here. This is the Battle of the Marne, and this is where we see the beginning of trench warfare, right? And so why does the Schlieffen Plan fail? Well, for a few different reasons. Number one, the Belgians' surprising resistance to Germany's invasion slowed down the German offensive into France, which allowed the French and the British to put up a better defense and get their act together. Basically the left of the German line that had failed to lure the French army into Alsace-Lorraine and destroy it. The French stuck their ground. And when I say Alsace and Lorraine, I'm referring to these territories right in here, okay, where the French forces are. And the left wing down here, all right, which is what I was talking about, the German left wing, does not lure the French forces far enough out. And instead, they're able to turn back, and they get kind of dragged down in this Battle of the Marne that turns the conflict into a stalemate. The Russians also mobilized much more quickly in the east than the Germans predicted that they would. And so the Germans, earlier on than they expected, had to send divisions to the east in order to defend German territory. on the eastern side as the Russians were attacking. The French and the British counterattack at the Battle of the Marne was decisive, and it halted the German invasion and creates this trench warfare. So trench warfare resulted in a stalemate. When we talk about that word stalemate, by the way, what a stalemate is it's a term in chess where neither player has enough pieces on the board in order to get a checkmate. And instead what ends up happening is you just kind of keep moving your pieces in circles around the board and no one ever wins or gains any ground. So that's what a stalemate is, and that's how they begin to describe World War I. A long line of trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border in the south. And basically they're these zigzagging parallel trenches that are built side by side to one another, and you're fighting between the trenches in what is a territory known as no man's land, both because no man wants to be there and because no man controls it. And so trench warfare resulted in a stalemate and lasted 4 bloody long years. Despite massive casualties on both sides, very few gains were made in terms of gaining territory against the other side. By 1916, 2 years into the conflict, there had been massive casualties, but neither side could break through to the other side. And there are a couple of battles that took place in 1916 that were extremely high numbers of deaths. And the first one that we'll talk about is known as the Battle of Verdun, which began in February of 19. This was a very long battle, and Germany basically wanted to start fighting a battle of attrition. That they were no longer looking to take over France. They were simply trying to kill more people than the French were. Okay, kill more French people than the French were able to kill of German people. So they wanted to bleed France white. What that is a reference to is if a person bleeds out, their skin turns a pallid, pale color. And of course, when they say bleed France white, they're not only referring to literally their soldiers dying, but they're referring to the white flag of surrender, where the French flag no longer would, have color to it. And in the Battle of Verdun, France lost over a half a million people. 540,000 people were killed in this battle. Germany lost themselves 430,000. And it ends up, so between the two of them, nearly 1 million people were killed in the Battle of Verdun. And for what? For what? The second bloodiest battle in the war, and a gain in territory of no joke, like 5 miles or something. Okay? 5 miles and 1 million people killed. I mean, I want you to imagine a 5-mile drive. A 5-mile drive from Eastvale would be like going down the freeway to Chick-fil-A off of Hidden Valley, okay? And for that amount of territory, which is nothing in the scheme of a war, okay? We're talking about entire countries here. They're fighting over a territory of about 5 miles, and 1 million people are killed in the Battle of Verdun. It is extremely high levels of casualties. The leader of the French military was General Philippe Pétain, and he was the leader of the French forces in the battle at Verdun. The defense of France in this battle made him a national hero. Interestingly, Philippe Pétain will end up going on to become a Nazi collaborator as a French politician in Vichy, France. In World War II, about 20 years later, he will collaborate with the Nazis, and it will be something of a long-lasting disgrace to his name. So that's the story there. One of the things that can happen when you're in a trench for a long period of time is that you're in these trenches. If you've ever dug a hole in your backyard, like I used to do as a kid for no good reason, what you'll find very quickly is that the hole that you dig in your backyard will fill up with water. And because rain goes to the lowest point. And so what ends up happening in these trenches is they dig these trenches out and they fill up with water, and you're walking around on, you know, dead bodies. You're walking around in mud, and your shoes and socks soak completely through, and it can give you something called trench foot, which is basically a long-lasting infection of the foot where basically your skin starts to peel off and become necrotic and die. And it's really gross, really painful, but it's because the water is filthy in these trenches with all sorts of vermin, mice, rats, other things living in these trenches with you. It's not sanitary. And when your feet, I don't know if you've ever stepped in a puddle before and your shoe gets soaked and you're walking around and your shoes like, you know, it's a terrible, terrible feeling, even just to have to put up with for a short time. But imagine months on end of your skin when it gets wet like that turns soft, you know, and it peels away and it gets chafed, and it can become infected, particularly if the water is dirty, which it was. And so anyhow, this is trench foot, and a lot of World War I soldiers ended up suffering from this medical condition. Here you can see the Western Front maybe a little bit more clearly on this map, less crazy to look at. Here you can see the German offensive through Belgium going down to the Battle of the Marne, and the French forces responding there as well. And so we just talked about the Battle of Verdun, okay? The Battle of Verdun took place right here. Here you can see Verdun, February until July. So it was about a 4 or 5 month battle in 1916. And then shortly thereafter, after the end of the Battle of Verdun, we see the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. And this began in July of 1916. And there were massive casualties, but neither side could break through. The British and the French offensive was the Battle of the Somme to try to break through German lines. The Battle of the Somme ends up being the bloodiest battle of the war. There were 420,000 British men who lost their lives in the Battle of the Somme, another 200,000 French soldiers, and 650,000 German soldiers were killed during the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest battle of the war. Eric Remarque was an author who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front in the year 1929, 10 years after the end of the war, and it illustrated the horrors of trench warfare and was based on the battles of Verdun and the Somme. The Western Front, technological advancements in war increased the number of casualties. Why was World War I so deadly compared to the wars that had been fought before it? Well, a big part of it has to do with these machine guns, in specific known as the Vickers Machine Gun. The Vickers Machine Gun took a weapon that previously, in Napoleonic times, back in the early 1800s, took about a full minute to reload. You'd be able, if you were really fast with a rifle, which had to be manually single shot loaded as with a musket back in the olden days, if you were really fast with a rifle, you might be able to get off 2 shots in a minute. Okay, 2 shots in a minute. And remember that the accuracy of these weapons was not very good. And so you had to be in relatively close range with a musket in order to have any chance of hitting your target. It's not like it's a sniper rifle or something like that. Okay, these weapons, you could barely hit the broadside of a barn with them, much less a smaller moving target. So, early weapons going back to the American Revolution, the Napoleonic era in the late early 1800s, the weapons were extremely primitive. And as we move throughout the 1800s, technology, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, is improving. And they start creating things known as breech loading rifles. Breech loading rifles are rifles where you essentially have a magazine or a side loading weapon where you have a breech in the weapon where you're able to load ammunition into the side of the weapon. And so these kinds of guns were much faster and much more accurate. And the natural improvement on weapons, of course, was to create guns that shot not only more rounds, but shot those rounds faster and more accurately. And by the time that we get to the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, into the early 20th century, the early 1900s, there are a number of extremely advanced weapons comparative to the previous century with these Vickers machine guns, which previously, if you were good with a musket, firing off 2 rounds a minute, now you're firing off, no joke, anywhere between about, what is the fire rate of a Vickers machine gun? I should probably look it up. 450 to 500 rounds a minute, okay? A minute. So if you were gonna think about that for us, that's amazing. How many rounds is that a second? 500 divided by 60. It's firing literally 8 rounds a second. Okay, it's fast. Okay, it really shoots very, very quickly. And this is primarily the reason that World War I is so deadly. You have previously, your weapons, you could get off 2 shots in a minute. Now you're firing 8 shots a second, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And it is really, really gruesome in terms of how this translates to casualties. So it was first used effectively by the Germans in mowing down French and British offensive in trench warfare, but it was later employed on both sides. One machine gun equaled the effectiveness of 40 men with rifles. So a machine gun was extremely deadly. This is the Vickers machine gun. That's what it looks like. Okay. And so as you can see, it sits on like a little tripod, and it can produce, a tremendous amount of rounds in conflict. And so, all right, technological advances continuing here. Tanks. Another major development was the use of artillery that was now made mobile, in contrast to cannons that were used in previous war. Now, basically, they mount cannons on tanks and armored vehicles. And the reason they did that is because tanks could navigate treacherous terrain and not worry about getting stuck in trenches and other things like that. So tanks were very useful, as opposed to if you were trying to wheel out cannons, like in an older style conflict, that would have been miserable. So they make them mechanized, they mobilize the cannons and turn them into tanks. And then you have airplanes. Airplanes were used for the first time ever in World War I. And the initial air flights, dogfights as they're sometimes called, initial air fights were actually when pilots would bring pistols and rifles up in the planes with them and shoot, like they'd be flying the plane or have a co-pilot, and then they'd shoot each other in the sky. It was really amazing. Eventually, guns are mounted to the planes, and in fact, one of the best designs that the Germans came up with in terms of planes was the fighter plane, which was known as the Fokker, F-O-K-K-E-R, and the propeller on these planes was synchronized with the machine gun. And so the way that this worked is, you would, if you were firing the gun through the propeller, unless it was synchronized, what would happen is you'd just blow the propeller off the plane and then your plane would crash, okay? You can't do that. You have to have it synchronized. And the Germans were the ones who came up with the technology to synchronize the propeller with the machine gun mounted to the plane, so that every time you fired the machine gun, the bullet would pass through the propeller without hitting it. And that's a pretty amazing technology, because obviously machine guns fire really fast, and plane propellers move really fast. So they had to develop this technology to make sure that they don't blow off their own propellers, and they use it very effectively. The Red Baron, as he's sometimes known, is a guy by the name of Manfred von Richthofen. Manfred von Richthofen was probably the best known pilot in all of World War I. He was known as the Red Baron, and he had the most what do they call it? The most air kills, okay, where he would go up and he would engage other planes in combat and shoot them out of the sky. And the British also began using planes to bomb German Zeppelin bases, and that was the other side of Germany, is they used Zeppelins, or large blimps, that were really pretty amazing looking. Again, if you go back and play those old games like Battlefield 1, I don't think I have Battlefield 1 on this computer. I do own it, but I don't think I have it installed right now. But on Battlefield 1, there are various missions where, you're on like Zeppelins and stuff like that. It's a pretty cool game, actually. They did a really good job with it. But if you've ever played games like that, that's, a reference to using those Zeppelins. And those Zeppelins could really cause problems if you weren't careful. And so the British would bomb the Zeppelins and try and prevent the Germans from being able to use them to their advantage. Here you can see an old World War I style tank. They look different. Tanks' designs end up looking different than this. Down the line, the tracks on tanks are lower profile, and but these ones look cool. I think they have a cool retro vibe to them. But these are tanks, and the tanks would be used by both sides. If you managed to kill the tank crew, they would throw the bodies out of the tank and then jump in the tank and take it for themselves. So it was sometimes difficult because you never knew who was approaching in a tank. It could have been an enemy, or it could have been your ally, because they would both commandeer each other's vehicles and paint their insignia on it and then use it. And so, this is a German tank right here. As you can see, again, very different design from what we see in like World War II. The German tanks in World War II are some of the best designed tanks in military history, for their time at least. And you can see here the Germans had a different type of design back in World War I. Lower profile tracks, but not as mobile, and very, very, very heavy. And the gearboxes in these were so-so. Better than some other tanks. Like the British tanks were pretty bad in some respects, but you know, the German tanks slightly better designed, but not as good as in World War II. And then you can see here the planes. Take note that they're flying biplanes here, meaning planes with two wings. These are very, very early style planes. Okay, these are not super fast planes. They don't have a long range, and they are relatively weak. They will get knocked out of the sky. You know, weather conditions could impair flight very easily in these. And so, you know, these planes are not exactly super safe. And here you can see a German plane that has crashed into the French countryside here. Here, this is an actual image. It's a still from a film that was taken actually. And this is an actual image of planes flying in formation, and this image is being taken by a cameraman sitting in the back of the plane, looking out the back of his plane at the planes behind him. And I just think it's such an awesome image. But this is kind of what those dogfights would look like. You'd be flying in the sky looking for other planes to shoot them down. Obviously all these planes are on the same side as they're making this movie here, but anyhow. Technological advancements, continuing, talking about some technological advancements. In the background on this image, you can see what's known as a U-boat, which is short for Unterseeboot, which is German for underwater boat. And that's what a U-boat is. It's a submarine. And the subs that the Germans produced initially had devastating effects on Allied shipping all throughout the war. The Germans used submarines extraordinarily effectively. They were very, very, very frustrating to the Allied powers because there was, in the early days, it was very difficult to know if a submarine was nearby. Eventually, in World War II, the British developed a technology known as radar, ASDIC, which is the ability to send a ping through the water, and they're able to hear or visualize where the boats are, the submarines are underwater. But none of that technology existed in World War I, and so the U-boats were very, very, very sneaky, and they could sneak up on British ships and blow a hole in the hull of the ship, no problem, and then escape before the ship even finished sinking. And so the U-boats were used with devastating precision by the Germans. Even though the British and the Russians also had submarines, they were not of as high quality design. And the German use of U-boats was the most important reason for why the United States eventually got involved in the war, is because the German U-boats had disrupted shipping on the Atlantic that the Americans relied on. And also there was a passenger liner called the Lusitania, which was a ship that had been carrying a number of American passengers that got sank. And for a while, the Germans are told not to use unrestricted U-boat warfare anymore, and they agree not to, but eventually they resume using unrestricted U-boat warfare, and afterwards the Americans get into the conflict because they, had told them not to use U-boats anymore. Also, they used poison gas, and the poison gas was used on the trenches. Gas is heavier than, the poison gas, mustard gas, is heavier than air. And the reason that they used gas is because it would sink into the trenches. The problem with using gas, though, is it's deadly if the wind changes direction, which this happened during the war. If you were to release a bunch of gas and then within an hour the wind changes direction, it could blow it back onto you, and that could end up killing your own men. And this sometimes would happen during the war. You had to be very cautious about using mustard gas. And the impact of gas ultimately gets negated by the use of gas masks by the Allies, but it's nonetheless really, really horrible because it's biological warfare, chemical warfare rather. And using these chemicals, they would burn your eyes out, your lungs out, and ultimately could suffocate and kill you. And here is a U-boat that's washed ashore here, and kind of cool, you know, pretty cool, you know, ship design. That's a World War I U-boat. And then here you can see mustard gas blowing across the Western Front near Flanders, Belgium. The Germans were the ones to first use gas, but then both sides used it. And as I said, the gas would sink down into the trenches, and the idea was when the gas sinks into the trenches, people would jump out of the trench and then you mow them down with machine guns as you're waiting for people to evacuate the trench. Ricardo, yes, we are going to have a final. Yes, we are. It'll be on World War I. And there will be a couple of probably questions from past units in there as well. Here you can see a gas mask that has been fitted for this mule here, okay? And these guys wearing gas masks. Here you can see these are British soldiers wearing, or actually I think these are American soldiers in this image here, wearing gas masks and the old style doughboy helmets. And here you can see an English gas bomb. This is a bomb that did not go off, but as you can see, the bomb had a handle on it and you would throw it. And you know, they would use these gas bombs and it would release poison gas. And here's the effects of somebody who experienced the gas firsthand. It would burn the skin and leave people pretty crippled. And here you can see an image of an armored train in Galicia in 1915. Adding armor to trains dates back to the American Civil War, actually. And this train here has just been fitted with extra plates of usually cast iron or steel, and riveted to the side of the train to protect the train from any sorts of bombings or things like that. And then here you can see Zeppelins, and these Zeppelins are these kind of, you know, blimps that were used by Germany to bomb London and other civilian targets. The Zeppelins were vulnerable though because they have hydrogen in them, and so hydrogen is super flammable. And I have a dentist appointment and will be getting surgery on Friday. Are we going to be doing anything important on that day? Well, I mean, I'd like to think that every day is somewhat important, but you know, nothing out of the ordinary on Friday, I wouldn't say. I think you'll probably be fine. Worst comes to worst, you can just shoot me a message and ask how class went or whatever, and I can tell you about it. But I don't think you're not going to miss like a test or anything like that. There may be an assignment that will be assigned on Friday or on Thursday. I'm not really sure yet, but anyhow. So Zeppelins were used by Germany to bomb London and others, but they were vulnerable because they were filled with hydrogen. And when the British developed exploding air shells, they were able to blow up the Zeppelins using these exploding shells and destroy them in the air. Also, really important to World War I was the use of radio. Wireless technology using radio signals, FM and AM in particular, made communication more effective in the battlefield. So the Germans took advantage of Russia's lack of radio capability and tapped into Russian phone lines to discover the Russian battle plans before they had actually initiated their battles. And so radio was super, super important for communication over long distances and coordinating offensives particularly on the Eastern Front, where the Germans were fighting against the Russians. Here you can see just a slightly more zoomed in image of these Zeppelins. And talking a little bit more about the Eastern Front, the main German military leaders during this time are General Paul von Hindenburg, who we're going to talk more about later, and another guy, General Erich von Ludendorff. If you saw the Wonder Woman movie, I think it was, or maybe it was some other movie, I forget which movie it was, but there was some comic book movie where it was set in World War I times, and they made General Ludendorff like the crazed bad guy in the movie, which I found to be very, very funny, because Ludendorff was just like some guy. You know, he's not like an evil, he's not like some sort of evil, I don't know what to describe, like evil doer. Okay, he's just some military German commander guy. He's not, I felt kind of bad for him because I watched this movie. I think it was Wonder Woman, if I'm not mistaken. But he was this crazed lunatic bad guy portrayed as like super evil in this movie. And he's really not. He's just some guy in history. But he's not like Hitler, for example. You know, Ludendorff was just like some old military dude in the German military. Anyway, Ludendorff defeated the invading Russian armies at Tannenberg, and this turned the tide of the war in the east. And the Russians were poorly organized and suffered horrific casualties at the hands of the Germans, and this would not be forgotten as the sentiment of the Germans and the Russians. There's not much love lost there. They hate one another, and the Russians in particular lost 5 people for every 1 person that the Germans lost. Okay, I want you to consider those numbers. You know, the Russians, in terms of casualties in the conflict, the Russians lost tremendous numbers of people. Okay, we're talking in the millions, where everybody else was, you know, like far less than that. So, you know, of the 10 million people that were killed in World War I, half of them were Russian. Okay, 5 million of them were Russian. So that just goes to show you, you know, how unbelievably devastating the conflict was for Russia. And the conflict gets so bad for Russia that they ultimately end up having to drop out of the war, because the soldiers refuse to fight anymore because they're dying so much. They know they're losing so badly. And we'll talk more about that next unit when we start off next semester talking about the Russian Revolution. But the Russians really struggle in World War I towards the end of it, and so they end up having a revolution happen in their country, and a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin, who is a communist revolutionary, ends up taking over the Russian government. He overthrows the Russian dynasty known as the Romanov dynasty. And the Tsar, the leader of Russia, and his whole family end up being killed. And Russia turns into the Soviet Union, which is a communist state under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin's promise to the people was that he would assure them peace, land, and bread. And the peace, land, and bread that he assured them started with peace in World War I. And so in order to get out of the conflict, Vladimir Lenin, after the revolution took place and he was in control of government, he signs a treaty known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans. And what this did was it got Russia out of the war, but at a major cost to Russia, because they had to give up about 1/4 to 1/3 of their western Russian territories over to the Germans. However, The reason that they were willing to do this, to give up this massive amount of territory to get out of the conflict, was because by this point, America was entering into the war. And Vladimir Lenin wisely believed that if he could settle peace with the Germans as the Americans were entering into the conflict, the Americans would come in, end the war in favor of the Allies, and that Russia would get their land back. And they did. So even though the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, for a short period of time, Russia loses a bunch of territory, the end of the war is near. Germany ends up losing the war, and they're forced to give that territory after losing the war back to Russia. So it doesn't ultimately have a long-term impact on the Russian state. Here are some images. Here's Paul von Hindenburg. The reason Paul von Hindenburg is an important figure in history is less to do with his involvement in World War I, which was important, but more importantly, Paul von Hindenburg ends up becoming the president of Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And it's under Paul von Hindenburg's watch that Hitler is able to rise to power. Now, to be clear, Paul von Hindenburg hated Hitler. He absolutely hated him. He had absolutely no love for him at all. However, Hitler was a much more cunning politician than Paul von Hindenburg was. And Hitler ends up using certain weaknesses of the German democratic system to his advantage, and subtly gaining more and more and more power within the German government under Paul von Hindenburg's nose. And so Paul von Hindenburg is an interesting character in history. After World War I, frankly, both Hindenburg and Ludendorff, pictured here, both of these guys should have been completely disgraced after World War I. They should not have been able to keep a name for themselves. But because Germany is so punished after the war, and so angry at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll learn about towards the end of this unit, because Germany had been brutally punished for their instigating World War I, ultimately these guys managed to kind of stick around and preserve their name and enter into positions in government. Rather than being ashamed, which they should have been at the end of World War I, these guys are able to retain some degree of political influence. And that is not good, because it helps stoke nationalism in Germany again, and that's what causes the rise of Hitler. And so here you can see, now these guys are not Nazis. To be clear with you, these guys are Germans, but the Nazi party is not until later on, okay? So after World War I ends. And so anyhow, these guys are kind of the major German military leaders. And here you can see them. Here's Paul von Hindenburg on the left, Ludendorff on the right over here. And then in the middle, this is Kaiser Wilhelm II, the monarch of Germany, the emperor of Germany. And here they are looking at a map, talking with one another about World War I plans. All right, the Gallipoli campaign will be the last thing that I talk about here today, and then I'm going to put an assignment for you guys up there and have you guys do that, but for the rest of the class. But the Gallipoli campaign was the attempt by the West to resupply Russia from the south. And so let's take a look here at what I mean. Here's Austria-Hungary, here's that area known as the Balkans, here's Greece, here's Turkey, the Mediterranean Sea down here. This is the area that we're looking at. And here's Russia all the way up here, all right? So this is the region of Europe. Here, let me show you on this bigger map here where we're looking at here, okay? We're looking down here at this region here, okay? We're zooming into the Balkan region. And here's the Black Sea, and here's Russia up here. As you can see, France, Britain, okay, they're all the way over on the western side of Europe. Russia over here is all the way on the eastern side of Europe. and they can't get to Russia through the North Sea and Baltic Sea because the Germans have U-boats crawling all over these places here. So the U-boats were disrupting the British ability to ship stuff to their ally, Russia. Meanwhile, it's really difficult to get up to Russia through the south because the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, had, by the time that the war started, sided with the Central Powers. So, the Gallipoli campaign is going to be a plan for the Western powers of France and Britain to ship supplies across the Mediterranean Sea up through this region right here up to Russia. But in order to do that, they have to go through hostile territory. So, the Gallipoli campaign is this attempt by the West to resupply Russia from the south. The British and the Australian forces unfortunately failed to take the Dardanelles Strait as a step towards taking Constantinople and defeating the Turks. The Turks, the Ottomans, fought much harder than the British were expecting them to, and they successfully defend their territories. This is the Dardanelles Strait. The Dardanelles Strait is what needed to be taken by the Brits in order to supply Russia via the Black Sea. But they have to go through this Gallipoli Peninsula here. And once again, as they approach the Gallipoli Peninsula to get through the Dardanelles Strait, they are unable to do so. They get bogged down once again in trench warfare. And in total, about 200,000 British troops were killed or wounded, and then of all people, 500,000 total people lost their lives in the Gallipoli campaign, which lasted for about 11 months from February all the way up until December of 1915, before the British basically throw in the towel and say, we quit, we can't do it anymore. Meanwhile, the British also are getting involved in the Middle East, and you may have heard of Lawrence of Arabia. T.E. Lawrence was a British military officer who scored major victories in the Middle East to weaken the Turks. And the British gained support from a number of Arab tribes who resented the Ottoman domination throughout the region. So this is why we see the development of various Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq, Iran, and various others, Syria, and a number of other Middle Eastern countries that gained their independence from the Ottoman Empire thanks to Lawrence of Arabia during World War I. So that kind of wraps up my lecture for today. And here you can see again the map where they were trying to get through the Gallipoli Peninsula over through the Dardanelles Strait. They were unsuccessful in doing so, and Russia never ends up being able to be supplied by France and Britain effectively. And here you can see an Australian troop over here. This is some war propaganda. A call from the Dardanelles, Cooey, won't you come over here to the Dardanelles Strait to help us out? So this is some Australian war propaganda over there from World War I, which you don't see too often. And that brings us to the end of today's lecture. I'm going to be putting up an assignment for you, so be making sure to check Canvas. And that does it for me. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again on Thursday. Take care.